Hi guys. Okay, so this is the first video of our classes. I'm gonna make these videos not um, as the whole class at all. Don't worry. This video, as you could tell already, is not that long. I'm just gonna try to give you a little bit of the lecture time that I usually do when we were able to not be in this kind of quarantine situation. Um, and I also hope that I can make a decent video. I was watching yesterday a comedian saying how most people don't know how to do these videos, like how to look at the camera and so on. So I hope this is not too distracting for you. And yeah, funny enough, this is the first video is going to be about the author I specialize in, or one of the authors I specialize the most in, which is Beckett, Samuel Beckett, right? So to talk about Beckett, just to give you like a general context, like his biography is important, I think, but as you could tell from our previous classes, I don't think that biographies explain completely the text, or that is supposed to be approach that we do. That's a very like 19th century, early 20th century approach, right? Although it's interesting sometimes to look at their lives and so on. But Beckett. Samuel Beckett was born in 1906 in Dublin, in Foxrock, a kind of suburb, like fancy suburb around Dublin. And what I can tell you is he had, a very bourgeois kind of like education. He was also, good at sports and so on, from a Protestant family, has one brother. And anyway, um, as you know, he's kind of started like going towards like an academic career. He was really good at languages and literature, but then very quickly he was not gonna discover he wasn't gonna do that. He went to Paris and studied there for a little bit as a youngster. I think in his early 20s. Then this is like the 20s, 30s in Paris. So like you have this kind of very big intellectual scene happening with new philosophies and phenomenology happening. What will become later existentialism, if you will, even though it's a philosophy that I think we overuse its term. But anyway, so he kind of decides to stay in Paris. He kind of likes it, right? He's writing in English at the time. If some of you, and I really hope I can convince a few of you to take my Beckett class next semester, we'll see how his early works are actually in English. They were written in English. In Paris, what happens too is that he meets James Joyce. By some common acquaintances, he meets the famous Irish writer James Joyce, and he starts kind of like working with him, helping him rather as friends, not as a worker, but helping him to write Joyce's last work, which is Finnegan's Wake. We can talk about that later in the comments. But anyway, and after that, what is approaching is World War II, right? So with the approach of World War II, he's still there, like writing and so on, trying to get published in London because he's still writing in English and so on. And World War II happens, and then he is dragged into it as part of the French resistance. He works pretty much because of his language skills. He works pretty much as a translator and like helps with messages and so on. Anyway. He has to, when the Germans come and occupy Paris, he has to flee. They get one of his friends, who later sadly dies in a concentration camp. He has to flee. He flees to the south of France, to the unoccupied zone. But, it's kind of still like a life in hiding, right? Like from the Germans that were around, the Nazis. So while he's there, he writes a novel still, like in English. What? It's a very interesting novel. And then, finally, the Allies come and France is liberated, and then he gets back, right? And he even gets the famous Croix d'honneur, or Cross of Honor, which is one of the highest kind of medal that the French government can give you, right? And is given to those who fought during World War II, especially in the resistance. And anyway, by that time, what happens is that he starts writing. Like he turns to French. He had kind of done like a few poems here and there in French, but he was still writing in English. But he completely turns into French, right? And he writes this giant trilogy called of 3 books: Molloy, Malone Dies, and The Unnameable. And they're pretty big. I have them here. Maybe I'll show them to you in a second. And then while he's writing this, and they're like one of the three of the most like revolutionary experimental novels of all time and of modernity. They tend to, some people see them as, or some critics see them rather as the works that divided that are in the threshold, right, between modernism and postmodernism. But anyway, in the middle of that, while he's writing that, in order to rest and to relax, he writes Waiting for Godot, which becomes, of course, one of the most famous plays of all times, especially of the 20th century. You might have heard about it. Anyway, fast forward. So he starts writing in French more and more. It becomes kind of his main language for writing. But then later, he kind of goes back to English, right? Like he goes back to English here and there a little bit. And one of the first things he does in English is gonna be Happy Days, right? The play that you read, Happy Days. And it is a play that it is very, as you could see, is very, very it's Beckettian, right? Like if you know something about Beckett, like it tends to have like Waiting for Godot, these landscapes that are like deserts, right? Like these kind of post-apocalyptic landscapes that imitate the idea of barren land for, you know, after civilization is gone in some way, right? While at the same time keeping a lot of the main traits of civilization, like Winnie's like dress and hat and her habits, right? Like we see that her habits playing a significant role in this play, right? This landscape also is reminds us of Waiting for Godot, where you have is also a barren landscape with famously there's only like a tree with barely at the beginning the tree has no leaves whatsoever, and then from Act 2 to the second act, one leaf appears there, right? In this case, that the tree in Waiting for Godot tends to be it's more like the idea of kind of some the woods, right? Some lost woods, some lost countryside, pretty much the countryside, right? While here we have pretty much the desert, right? Like and the sun and the heat of the desert, right? And the sand that is covering Winnie, right? In these mountains, right? So we see again this kind of landscape, post-apocalyptic landscape, this idea of the desert that can also make you think in our Christian tradition, right? Like as you know the trip of Christ to the desert, right? Of Jesus to the desert in order to confront himself and to confront the devil, right? So it's kind of a trope that we've seen in literature in other of our classes, right? So we have that part here. It also, because of the whole repetitive part of it, and also not only the repetition, but also the repeated torture, right? Like we see in Act 2, this moment when, for example, she's not allowed to close her eyes, right? At least not until the right time, right? Like every time she's gonna close her eyes, the bell rings, like you gotta wake up, right? And that comes also from our tradition in, especially as it's figured by Dante, right? By the idea of hell, right? The inferno of Dante, right? Which is the eternal punishment and eternal repetition, and it's you know the circles of Dante's Inferno, pointing out to the cyclical part of this, right? Like everything has to be repeated in this way, right? So it's very different from the eternal return of the same, as we mentioned in Nietzsche, related as well, right? Like Nietzsche kind of tried to find in it a more positive way of thinking, thinking about it as, you know, live your life in a way that you will be, you know, willing to repeat it forever in eternity, right? That's kind of more of the moral part of it. But yeah, in Happy Days we have this also repetition, right? It also points out to something that, and I think Destiny in here, I'm gonna look here. I know I should not be looking off camera that much, but looking at Destiny is the only one so far, I think, Joe, who have commented on the play yet, or have, you know, answered the discussion forum. But Destiny mentions already here, right? Like that side of how the repetition points to like routines, right? Like the routines that we're doing every day, like routines as the amount of things that, you know, give order to our lives in some way, right? Like so every morning, like I go down, let my dog out, prepare myself a cup of coffee, right? Have my breakfast. It's usually the same breakfast, right? And so on, right? Speaking of, let me give us it. Okay, so So anyway, so that part of repetition, the other part that we have to link it to is habit, right? And Beckett wrote a book, a small book on an author, a very important author for not only French but modern literature in general, called Marcel Proust. And Proust talks a lot about habit, right? And Beckett in Habit sees, when he analyzes Proust, sees this pretty much the negative side of habits, right? Which is the negative side of habit, the negative side of cliches is the idea that you can't, they stop you from thinking, right? Like habit is a thing that we do unconsciously, right? Like, so when you live and the word routine gives us that a lot, right? Like when you live a life of habit and routine, like you are not thinking really, you are not having that original thought or that original moment. You're just like going, through the motions, right? That explains it really well. And that's something that Winnie does a lot, right? She goes through the motions and she's like really wondering about when has she combed her hair, has she brushed it, right? Like this whole thing, right? Has she used her umbrella already, right? Her parasol, is she going to do it again? Like this whole idea of like the steps that we follow through the day and that they should be following a particular order, right? To give precisely order to life, but at the same time they stifle the originality, right? And in Happy Days, as you saw, the originality comes in kind of this ownership of a few things, right? The way that I was, as yesterday I was preparing the class, the way that I group them together, right, is when Winnie talks about my song, right, my prayer, like say your prayer, Winnie, right, my poem, right, and then my story, right, which is, it takes us back to some of our discussions, right, about like what makes each person's soul, like what makes your singularity, what makes the thing that makes you who you are at the end. If everything we are is you know transpersed or immersed in language and in interaction with others, right? What is the thing that actually defines you, right? And I think in her, you can see, and the play is very good at it, like in the sort of climatic moments, there are these calls for her own things, right? So, for example, at the end of Act 1, right, where Willie is kind of going back into this repetition of what he did earlier with the newspaper, where he's just saying the same things, right? Like opening for smart youth, right? And then still reading, right? And wanted bright boy, like kind of the same lines. And at this time, when we're gonna finish the first act, right? She's doing still this, and I'm not an actor, so I apologize for doing this badly, right? But she's repeating these gestures that are so repetitive that if you don't watch the play, it's kind of hard to read it, right? Like, because you are reading things like, especially here at the end, like Winnie saying, no, smile, brother, right? So smiles. No, no, smile off. Puts on hat again, gazes front, pause, right? And now, sing. Sing your song, Winnie. No, then pray. Pray your prayer, Winnie. Right, and then we have this pause where like we see Willie in the back, like turning the page of the Giants newspaper, right? Saying in the back, like, and usually in the place when if you've watched it or you've watched the other versions that are not online that I've seen, Willie, you barely hear Willie, like he's just kind of in the back, like want to go, right? But then yeah, the first act remarks this again, right? Like it ends with Winnie saying, "Pray your old prayer, Winnie," right? And with this ownership of your old prayer, your old song, that we see that there's also like this contrast with the old, right? And she also mentions a lot, not only the old but the classics, right? There's a lot of sentences about this going on and on, like the old style, those wonderful lines, that wonderful line, right? Later on, there's this part when in Act 2, right? She says like one loses one's classics, right? And to this one point, right, not only to the habits of a life but also to a tradition, right? Like we've been reading these books that are some of the books that we've been reading are like what considered like classics, right, or big books, and they are kind of supposed to be the foundations of our tradition, right? And that's when we question, and when we read them, right, like we question them in more and more, and not accept them as they come, because we know that there are things that are not okay with them, right? Like we were shocked at the beginning of the class when we were reading the Arabian Nights, right? Like, and see how the Arabian Nights starts precisely with this like act of violence of like killing these wives, right? Killing these wives, and then it is like a history of I mean, it's a horrible character who decides to kill like all first to like rape all the women in his land and then kill them, right? So and that's kind of the classics, right? Like, and we can think about Shakespeare, we can think about all of the classics that include this violence, right? But in this case, it seems that for Winnie, right, like they are part of like this script of her culture, and they give her uh, she has this ambiguous like, attitude towards them as like the old style, like it's like it makes her smile and then like waste like lose the smile immediately, right? It's kind of like it is a remembrance of youth and a remembrance of like good things, but it's also like already questioning it in one way or other, right? And especially questioning where will her particularity, where will her way of being show up, like her particular sense of being, right? Again, this is the part of the song of her prayer, right? And you see it in, I think Destiny mentioned as well in her question, the idea of the stories that she tells, right? Like of the little girl and the doll, right? Or like of being there and then having this couple passing by and talking to her, right? And of course, like part there of the uncanny, right? We mentioned this term often in class in the famous German unheimlich, right? The unfamiliar, right? Is how they see this woman like in deep pain in a horrible situation, right? When she's like buried up to her waist at the beginning and then up to the neck, right? They see this and they're this kind of like, oh, this is odd, but at the same time it's normal, right? Kind of pointing to like just suffering and pain of the other in general as something that we can still like be sensitive to it, but also already like unsensitive, like desensitized against it, right? So that kind of like also adds to the relation towards the other there, and the relation of her story, right? Like of what she went through towards the other people, right? And of course, the Winnie Willie situation that Destiny also mentions in her video, sorry, this is in her post. Of like this marriage, right? Like, and the point of like marriage as an institution and like of the lovers and all the past, right? And there, of course, like, I don't know if, I hope you guys watched one of the videos that I sent you, right? But what you see at the end, obviously, right? When Willie is approaching her, and it seems like a very sweet moment when like, they're going to like finally, touch each other, maybe like touch her face, kiss, right? She's saying like, you want to kiss. But it is the ambiguity of the gesture when we don't know if he's trying to approach her or he's trying to approach Brownie, the gun, right? Which also has a big factor there in the play, always the gun, right? And which the gun points obviously towards suicide, and suicide as the question of the end, right? As a question of being also like somebody putting an end to somebody's own life, right? And of course, in the play, you see this wonderful reflection on ending, right? Like, and the whole thing about it's expressed through the metaphor of singing, right? Like these lines that I really love when it's like to sing too soon is fatal, right? So you need to find the right time to sing, right? And at the end, she does sing, right? But she's thinking about like this idea of like how what is that it determines the end of somebody's life, and how much of it is external, right? How much of it is like society or external events that do it, how much of it is your own, right? Like, which is the big question about suicide, which is a question that was very strong in the head of people at this time, because you just came from World War II, and there was not only like there were suicides during World War II because of how strenuous it was, but there were a bunch of suicides afterwards because of survival guilt, right? Like some of the famous people who survived the Holocaust, like who went to the camps and were writers, like Primo Levi, a famous writer from Italy. He killed himself afterwards. I'm forgetting the other name of a few others, but so there is this thing in the air, right? Like of taking your own life and owning it, right? So anyway, in the play, it's taken more, or funny enough, it's linked to the idea of singing, right? Which I think it brings some sweetness to it, but it's this bitter sweetness in other ways, right? So anyway, that was a few of the things that I wanted to mention, right, to you. I think it's a play that is very relevant right now. I think as we find each other in these rooms, alone sometimes or with a few family members, right? But in this social distancing, I think actually I'm pretty excited about teaching the Beckett class in the fall, because I think that particularly since we're going through these very bizarre times where we have to like isolate ourselves yet have some kind of talking, like right now I'm talking to you guys, but also I'm just looking at myself, trying not to, but in the corner of my eyes looking at myself there. So it's this very self-reflective, right, like moment, and with social media more and more, right. So anyway, I'm looking forward to Joe's presentation on this. And I'm gonna be, as you'll see, online, so we can discuss more of this. So I hope this wasn't the worst video. Sorry, it was 20 minutes. I'll try to make them maybe shorter than that. But yeah, thank you guys for listening, and talk to you soon.